Good day, good evening, and welcome to our 16th installment of our local and subnational level government information webinar series. This webinar is made possible by the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework EU support project. And yes, like I said, we are all welcome to you all, and looking forward to a fruitful webinar and fruitful discussions today. So our webinar for today, the objective is just to get some reflections from our speakers from the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice, and the subsidiary body on implementation special virtual sessions that's currently on the way. Started on the 15th and runs until Friday the 18th. So our biodiversity planning work globally is still in full swing. I think majority of us are reflecting on what could have and should have been. I think people would have been full on in prep mode for COP15. That would have happened in a couple of weeks' time, but that was not to be. But that is not to say that the work stops there. So very excited and looking forward to the reflection from our speakers today. Just before we start, some house rules, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on all of our various platforms, platforms, as well as be emailed to all registrants, together with the presentations, of course. And just to say that by participating in this webinar, you give consent to being recorded. Also, the webinar is brought to you by the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments, and ICLEI is obviously the focal point for everything biodiversity related CBD. And as I mentioned, this is the 16th installment of this webinar series. We usually have two webinars per day. So this session, the 10 a.m. session, and then another afternoon session which starts at 3 p.m. CAT. So just to remind everyone that due to the SAPSTA and SBI virtual sessions that is currently on the way, we will not have a live session this afternoon, but we will rather play the recording of this current session for participants that is only able to join us this afternoon. So yeah, just to give you a sense of where we are at in the series. So as I mentioned, the session on the 17th of September today is the 16th installment, and the next one is on the 8th of October, which also coincides with ICLEI's Daring Cities Congress. So more information to be shared on that shortly. So just in terms of the agenda for today, so at the moment we're obviously busy with doing short welcome and introductions, and again welcome and thank you for joining us for these very informative but also very important sessions. We're going to learn a little bit about some reflections from, as I mentioned, from the SAPS and SBI special virtual sessions. We're going to hear a little bit about what the road ahead to COP15 looks like. So just some reflections on the roadmap to COP15, as well as an update on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and then some updates on upcoming events and global advocacy efforts. And just also to mention that towards the end, we'll have a question and discussion session towards the end of the webinar, at which time you will be given the opportunity to engage with our speakers and ask global questions. But I would advise that during the course of the webinar, if there are any questions or burning comments, please do make use of the chat and questions function on the dashboard. And if possible, if you can address a specific question to a specific speaker, that will definitely help us to ensure that the webinar runs as smoothly and as streamlined as possible. So just a note on our speakers. I think there might be some issues with bandwidth and connectivity issues. So we will try to keep our video switched off. But as I mentioned, I am the moderator for today. My name is Ryan Fisher. I'm a professional officer in ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Center. And then our panel for today is made up of Ms. Ingrid Coetzee, who's a senior program manager at ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center. Mr. Renata Gomez, thank you for joining us from Regions 4. Ms. Tamlin Duncan, also a professional officer at ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center. And then our very own Mr. Yunus Zarikan, Head of Global Policy and Advocacy at ICLEI World Secretariat. So a full program, very exciting reflections and interventions that will be shared. And without any further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Ms. Ingrid Coetzee, to just share some reflections on the SAPSTA SBI special virtual sessions and talk to us a little bit about the roadmap to COP15. So Ingrid, without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to our attendees from all over the world. It's really lovely to be here again today, and it's particularly interesting time because we are in the midst of a special virtual session that's being organized by the CBD to accommodate some of the technical meetings in the either the SAPSTA and the SBI meetings. So I thought what I would do today is just first of all give you a very short reflection on these meetings, and then before I hand over to Renata, who we are also very excited to have here again today, she has been with us previously, I'll just quickly run through and give you an update of the roadmap. So first of all, just on the program of the special virtual sessions, this is in part, it's a bit of an experiment, I think, by the CBD to see how effective virtual sessions can be when one has dialogue and debates and discussion and possibly also for the future purposes, negotiations virtually, whereas in the past it's always been a gathering of hundreds of delegates from all over the world. And obviously with COVID, that is no longer possible, or certainly for the foreseeable future. So what they have done is, because they've had to postpone the 24th session of SAPSTA and the 3rd session of the SBI so many times this year, it was first going to take place in May and then in August and then November, and very recently they announced only in the 1st quarter of next year. They felt it was important to maintain the momentum, not just towards COP15, but also because of the very important Biodiversity Summit being held at the end of this month by the United Nations General Assembly. And they wanted to also facilitate some of the preparations that need to be done at a technical level for SAPSTA and SBI, and that's why they've organized these special virtual sessions. And as part of the special virtual sessions, they've also launched the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which is a very important publication. It basically gives a status of the progress against the IT biodiversity targets at a global level, and then obviously also makes some recommendations in terms of its application value. So the sessions that are being run, the first session, which was held on the 14th, Tuesday the 14th, that was where they launched the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then yesterday, what they did, it was a very interesting exercise, actually. They led it was a testing of the review process of the the national reports, and they used through an open-ended forum. So what they did, there were 5 countries that presented updated reports on their national country reports. This was Ethiopia and Finland, Poland, Sri Lanka and Guyana. We went through 3 reports yesterday. They're going to be doing 2 more reports today. and each country then presented its report, and then there was a period allowed for questions and answers, which, because of the technical issues around simultaneous translation and the time, these questions had to be submitted beforehand. Today, then, as I said, we're dealing with 2 more reports. And then also there will be a short session on resource mobilization, and the panel of experts will present their findings in terms of the report that they have submitted. There have been opportunities, albeit very short opportunities, for interventions and statements by the CBD parties as well as observers. Certainly as a collective representing Regions 4, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, the European Committee of Regions, ICLEI, as well as the group of leading subnational governments towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. We are making joint statements. Renata will tell you about some of these statements. And I can just mention that ICLEI, on behalf of this group of networks, will hopefully be given an opportunity to make a short intervention in this afternoon session on resource mobilization. It will depend, obviously, on time. And then the session tomorrow is going to be very, very important, because that is a joint SABSTA and SBI session on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And in that session, the co-chairs of the working group, Mr. Francis Ogwal from Uganda and Basil van Haar from Canada, will present an update on the process in terms of developing the new framework. And they will also be talking about the very latest version, the updated Xero draft. Incidentally, a little later this morning, Tamlin Duncan will just give a short summary of what the content is in that. And then there's going to be an opportunity again for interventions there, and Renata will talk to that a little later. So I thought I would just reflect a little bit about the global biodiversity outlook, and we will provide you with a link towards the end of the seminar, because I think it's good to download it and have a look. It is available on the CBD website. And the interesting thing about this is that obviously it gives, as I said, it's the flagship program or publication from the convention. It provides a summary on the latest status as far as biodiversity is concerned globally, and the progress against the Aichi biodiversity targets. And it builds on information from the IPBES global assessments, as well as the national reports that countries have submitted. And sadly, it paints a very dismal picture. I mean, if you think that there are 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, and as far as progress is concerned, only 6 have been partially met. That is not a good picture. As the executive secretary said in a webinar a few evenings ago that Kobe Brandt, our CEO, moderated, she made the comment that if that was one of her children's school reports, she would be very, very angry and very upset. So it's not a pretty picture. I think we all know that we are in a real state of crisis as far as biodiversity is concerned. But what I found very interesting about this report, it also includes some very important information and guidance around what are the key transitions needed for sustainable pathways. And they've identified 8 of these transitions, and these are basically where they are saying these are the conditions that are necessary if we are to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. So essentially, they deal with the first one that they talk about as a key transition is the issue of land and forests. Fresh water obviously is important. Fisheries and oceans, sustainable agriculture, food systems, cities and infrastructure, climate and action, as well as One Health. And I think that particularly the last 4 are transition areas or areas of transition that need to be addressed and achieved that speak to the mandates and the work that is done both by cities and subnational governments. For example, just if you look at the cities and infrastructure one, where they talk to the issue of deploying green infrastructure and making space for nature within built landscapes to improve quality of health and the quality of life of urban communities on the one hand, but on the other hand also to reduce the environmental and ecological footprint that cities and infrastructure have. I think it's really important. And the other thing that comes out in that particular section is the recognition that as humans and as urban communities, we are dependent upon well-functioning and healthy ecosystems to sustain our lives, to support our economies. But also they make the point, and I think this is where the subnational governments come in as well, because it affects states and provinces, is that the teleconnections between cities and the nearby and distant ecosystems is also an important thing. And this is obviously where there's jurisdiction of local and subnational governments. I think then the other thing that I just want to highlight very briefly is sorry, if you can go to the next slide, please, Ryan, you were there. If we look at the roadmap, we're in September now, we're fast approaching the end of the year. The next big thing that's coming up on the agenda is the Nature for Life Hub, which is being organized by the UNDP, and there are many organizations involved in that. ICLEI is also supporting and facilitating the involvement of some cities and subnational governments. It's a very full program, and I encourage you to go and have a look. There is a website. You can also access it through the UNDP. Then, of course, the big highlight is going to be the United Nations General Assembly, the Summit on Biodiversity at the end of this month. We've got, from ICLEI's side, we've got Daring Cities, which is a big event. These are all virtual events. Daring Cities is taking place between the 7th and the 28th of October. And just to note that the 2 advocacy webinars that will be taking place on the 8th of October will be part of the Daring Cities program. There's a lot of sessions that deal with nature and biodiversity. And then, as I said just now, the SABSTA and the SPI meetings early next year, and the COP final dates haven't been set, but it is certainly being passed on to the later part of 2021. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. And yes, we actually have a link to the Global Biodiversity Outlook. So thank you for that snippet, Ingrid, of that very important and insightful report. So I think what we'll do is we'll make that link to the report available with the recording. So I now want to introduce and hand over to Mr. Renata Gomez from Regions 4. So Renata is the Biodiversity Program Manager and Coordinator of the CBD Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity and the Regions 4 Biodiversity Learning Platform. So Renata is going to share some reflections on the SAPS and SPI special virtual sessions with us as well. So Renata, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much to the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center and the Post-2020 Youth Support Initiative for this invitation. We are very honored to be here today to share some reflections on what's been like for us at Regions 4 and at the Advisory Committee to be participating in these special virtual sessions that Ingrid very well resumed to you. So as you know, I work for Regions 4, which is an association of subnational governments and regions from over 20 countries in the world. We work to represent their interests in environmental global agendas, and in particular, in the biodiversity agenda, we coordinate the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments to the Convention on Biological Diversity, together with the Government of Quebec, which is one of our members as well. So, like I said, I would like to share some reflections. As Ingrid very well mentioned, these sessions aim to facilitate preparations for the meetings of the subsidiary bodies We at the Advisory Committee and at Regions 4 believed and are convinced that these sessions will provide us with an opportunity to not only hear from the parties and observers, but also to take the floor and share our own ambitions for the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and, more importantly, its future implementation. As Ingrid mentioned earlier this week, the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook was presented. We had the opportunity through our partner, the group of leading subnational governments to the Haiti Biodiversity Targets, also known as goals, led by the Prefecture of Haiti, to send a message on behalf of local and subnational governments. So Mr. Kisuna, who represented goals and spoke on our behalf, welcomed the recognition of our level of government into the GBO5. He particularly mentioned the relevance given to city management and subnational planning, which was very important for us. Additionally, Teru recalled our hopes that the ongoing preparatory process toward COP15 would consider a more ambitious role of subnational and local governments in, like I said, the implementation of the new global framework. Teru also made an invitation to the parties and observers to the convention to join us in our Edinburgh process partners on a webinar that will take place on September 23rd. This webinar intends to inform the parties to the convention on the outcomes of the Edinburgh process. This event will also be an opportunity to discuss how the CBD can best integrate our constituencies over the coming decade. You can find more information on how to participate at the website of the Scottish Government. It's a pretty long link to the website, but I'm sure that in the Subnational Advocacy for Nature website, you can find more information on this event. So as I mentioned, we have partnered, and as you surely know from previous webinars, we have partnered with the Scottish Government and other allies, including ICLEI, of course, the European Committee of the Regions, the goals, and many others to advocate for a renewed and step-up decision dedicated to our constituencies that safeguards the legacy of Decision 10/22 and that raises the ambition for subnational and local actions towards implementing the post-2020 framework. So as part of those advocacy efforts, a delegate from the Advisory Committee is expected, if time allows, to take the floor tomorrow, Friday, during the session dedicated to the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is actually a special joint session of SOSTA and SBI. In our intervention, we will share the outcomes very briefly of the Edinburgh process. We want to make sure that the parties to the CBD know that this process has allowed us to see the impact of the decade-long plan of action on subnational cities and other local authorities, and that we continue to be committed to realizing our collective potential and play a stronger role in the future framework. Additionally, we will highlight the importance of the Edinburgh Declaration, which is a call for action that lays out the aspirations and commitments of course, the Scottish Government, the Edinburgh process partners, and the wider constituency of subnational and local governments that have been part of the process. This declaration continues to be open up until COP15. So I take the opportunity to invite you all to join and see what our specific commitments are about. Joining our voices with like-minded delegates and decision makers from all over the world is important because we know that we as local and subnational governments play a very important role in meeting the global challenges nature faces and in overcoming the devastating consequences of a global pandemic like the one we're living today. it's fundamental that we see this important role reflected also on the new global framework, and we are only going to be able to reach this ambition if we together, in an aligned and organized manner, share our inputs and ambitions to the CBD through its official channels. So finally, I just want to thank you for your attention. I invite you to become a more active part of these efforts by joining us, ICLEI, and us at Regions 4 in this advocacy effort. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I remain attentive to hear comments and questions when the time comes in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata, for those reflections, and to Ingrid as well for setting the scene for us. And I think that set us then up quite nicely for our next presentation that will be presented by Ms. Tamlin Duncan to give us a little update on the Xero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So Tamlin, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and hello to everyone on this webinar. I'll be giving an update on the Xero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And before I do, I'd just like to preface that the angle in which we've come at this summary assessment is through local and biodiversity constituency and how it will affect our local and subnational government constituency and not necessarily other biodiversity imperatives. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Ryan. Thanks. Okay, to put this document in context, I'd like to give a brief history. In Decision 1434, the Conference of the Parties, or COP, to the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as we know it, CBD, sets out the process for developing a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And they did so by establishing the open-ended working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to support this process. At the open-ended working group's first meeting, they requested the co-chairs and the executive secretary of the SCBD to prepare documentation for consideration at their second meeting. And part of this documentation included a Xero draft of this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, at the open-ended working group's second meeting, they considered the Xero draft and requested the co-chairs and the executive secretary to prepare a document updating those elements of the draft framework that had been reviewed by the working group, as well as taking into account some submissions that they had received. And they received submissions via notification that the SCBD sent out earlier in the year. This draft document contains an update, and this is the update that we will be looking at today. And it takes into account the outcomes of the second open-ended working group meeting, as well as those submissions that they received in response to the notification. It's important to note that this draft will be further updated to take into account the outcomes of the SABSTA 24 and SBI 3 meetings, which Ingrid covered will happen in the first quarter of 2021. And it will also take into account advice from thematic consultations. This updated draft will then be known as Draft 1, and it will be issued 6 weeks prior to the third meeting of the open-ended working group. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so it's important to understand what does this updated draft consist of. This draft was disseminated on the 17th of August this year, and these are some of the major changes that we have identified. The draft framework now has 4 long-term goals as opposed to 5. And while these 4 long-term goals cover the same ground as the previous 5, they are less specific with percentages. Only one of those goals contains a percentage, as opposed to previously almost all of those goals contained a percentage figure. Okay, there's been addition of 8 milestones to assess by 2030 in our progress towards the 2050 goals. This is completely novel, as the previous draft framework didn't have any milestones. The draft framework now has far more detailed descriptions in reference to implementation support mechanisms, as well as more detail regarding responsibility and transparency. It now sets out the system for planning, reporting, and review for national government entities, whereas previously it just set out that planning, reporting, and review should take place. In quite a progressive move, the new draft framework has consideration for the rights of nature where appropriate. And last but certainly not least, the new draft framework now mentions cities. Okay, now we'll look at the reference to local and subnational governments within this updated draft. Apologies for the poor quality. This is from a scan of the actual document. So we'll be looking at the enabling conditions section of this updated draft, and it basically clarifies certain enabling conditions which will be required for the implementation of the framework. And there's quite a lot of mention of local and subnational authorities within this section. Most notably 14b states that participation of all relevant stakeholders as well as local and subnational authorities are identified as an enabling condition for the implementation of the framework. Next, please. Thank you. And within the enabling conditions section, we go on to see that partnerships to leverage sustainable activities and programs at the national level are viewed as important for implementing this framework. As well, and most notably probably the active involvement of subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities, as well as a recognition of their competence and specific roles for the implementation of the framework. And that subsection L is extremely important for our constituency. Okay, moving on to some issues that have been identified. In Target 13 in the Xero draft, it states to integrate biodiversity values into national and local planning and development processes. And unfortunately, in the updated draft, within the same target, tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming, there is no mention of local planning. So this is potentially problematic. Okay, further in outreach, awareness, and uptake, within the Xero draft, there was previously a mention of all actors needing to help raise awareness of the framework and the need for a whole of society engagement in order to implement it. It also identified that local levels will need to implement this framework. And unfortunately, within the updated draft, there is no longer a mention of local level in terms of outreach, awareness, and uptake. Okay, and this brings me to my last slide. Our last identified issue is the inconsistent wording throughout the updated draft. Within this document, it refers to local level, local authorities, subnational level, subnational authorities, and subnational governments. And this is just within a 9-page document. So you can understand for such a high-level document how this wording could be problematic and potentially confusing. So we hope that this will be amended in the future. And I will pop a link to the updated document within the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamlin, for that short but sweet and very concise feedback and update on the Xero draft. And I agree, I think the mention and the emphasis on subnational level government is indeed a massive step in the right direction. So, which is well done to the entire team that's been working so hard on ensuring that this very ambitious objective is met going forward. So well done to the team. I would like to hand over to our last speaker, Mr. Yunus Arikan. He's the Head of Global and Policy Advocacy at the World Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. And Yunus is going to share some reflections on the subsidiary body special virtual sessions, as well as give us some insights on the roadmap to COP15. So Yunus, over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, especially first of all, the invitation from Cities Biodiversity Center, and congratulations for this very, very enlightening updates and also for your hard work collectively. It's really nice to see how you're advancing your engagement and taking the torch higher or the bar higher in terms of global advocacy of local and regional governments worldwide and across agendas. In my capacity as the director of advocacy in ICLE, I'm also engaged in the other UN processes, UN Environment and UN Habitat, UN Headquarters, High-Level Political Forum. I'm also active in the UN climate change negotiations in my capacity as the LGMA focal point. So what I want to put here is an complementary information about what you have been discussing so far is the space under the CBD, whereas obviously it is not in an isolation and it has to be receiving impulses or inputs from the rest of the global processes. Of course, the first point that we have to take into account is that this year 2020 we were expecting this to be the year for deal for nature, but it will also be the year a new wave of climate action, in particular in the Paris Agreement, because national governments were expected to present their second national determined contributions, which is important because the previous ones or the existing ones are not designed according to the spirit of the Paris Agreement, and they are well behind the reality, and they are not designed with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 degree and climate neutrality plus engagement of all levels of government. So none of the national current climate plans reflect this, and that's normal because all these climate plans were prepared before Paris Agreement. So this year, the reason why it is important to have additional or new report or new climate commitments from the national government is that we hope the new document will be much more compatible to the spirit of the Paris Agreement. As you know, the process, all the UN processes are now postponed to next year. We have been seeing number of virtual engagements, but the negotiations are on hold. I mean, they are not taking place. People are coming together, and the negotiators are coming together, but they're not making decisions. I think this is one of your biggest challenge. For example, the difference between the climate negotiations and the biodiversity negotiations is that because Paris Agreement exists, and because there's relatively a rule book, and because there's already NDCs available, even they are not bad, or they are not good in terms of ambition, the process is mainly at the national level, and the postponement of the process for next year and giving the chance to the national governments, the ministers of environment and the stakeholders, to focus at the national level is an opportunity because they can continue to work, and there can be a pressure to the national authorities through different initiatives. Whereas in the UNF, in the CBD process, the framework is still not available, and as my colleagues have been addressed here, there is zero draft, which is still not binding, which is still not opening. So you are a bit in a difficult situation as the CBD community, which means this engagement, that you follow every document, you follow every line by line, is extremely important, because it is the change that is happening at the global level, whereas in the case of climate change, the real action has to go to the national level, because the visibility is, or the procedures are not are clear, let's say. The only thing is what will come from the capitals, whereas in the biodiversity, it is still the global, let's say, vision has to be established. This is I observe as the main differentiation. So in that regard, of course, having a virtual session of Substa and SPI is a good effort to keep the momentum and the process going on. And obviously, we are aware of the challenges that you cannot easily adopt decisions. So I think it's good that you're part of this process. Meanwhile, what's happening is obviously the biodiversity is still in the hands of the ministers of environment. This is a Rio Convention, which is still under prerogative of environment community. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, whereas are a bit more at the national level, both at the Prime Minister level, which is beyond ministers of climate change. In the biodiversity context, we're still in this environment space. That is one of the reasons why this year the additional efforts are important to take this discussion beyond ministers of environment to the highest level. Therefore, these month, the UN Biodiversity Summit is important. The important point that we have to take into account that this means in the UN language, anything as a summit means heads of state. And let's recall, in the biodiversity process, except host countries who are convening the COPs, there's no heads of state engagement, or very few. Whereas in the climate process, because of this tension and pressure, especially towards Paris Agreement, and after every COP in Paris Agreement, there have been numerous heads of state attending the climate COP, which is unusual. I remember when we were living Sharm el Sheikh, we were saying that the Kunming should be the Paris moment for biodiversity and one of the opportunities to bring heads of state. Obviously, it was not possible because the agreement that came from Sharm el Sheikh is that the summit will be in New York during this UN General Assembly. The logic was that when there's heads of state engaged in the New York, they could extend their agenda one day more, that instead of traveling to Kunming, they can be discussing this. So this was a good approach from one perspective. Now, the reality is that the UN General Assembly is also virtual. So there's no heads of state going to New York. Therefore, the summit of the biodiversity will be also virtual. This is a reality that we cannot change. The good news is that the invitation from, because the host of the summit will be the President of General Assembly, which in the UN's perspectives, that means that it is a good political momentum, but it is not expected to have binding outcomes, no commitments that will be enforced or tracked later on. But it is raising the profile of the discussion. So good news, according to the agenda we have seen, it's an extreme long list of heads of states or prime ministers or heads of governments who wish to speak on biodiversity agenda. This has not happened before. That is something that has to be praised, that has to be used as an opportunity, because this means those people who are in a daily basis discussing the economic crisis, the ups and downs, or the stock exchange, or military interventions, this is the prime ministers of the countries, they are now forced to speak, or they are invited, or they are encouraged, and they are wishing to speak on biodiversity. That will give a long-term impact to our work. This will be elevating the profile of the biodiversity agenda in the global process. So that's good news. And the second good news is that when there's so many heads of state speakers, it was always challenge to have a slot for ourselves, for stakeholders. When it is especially the physical meeting, it was even harder. But luckily, this is the beauty of the virtual events now. It is much easier to engage because the technology is more appropriate. So the definition of the summit says leaders as heads of state or other leaders. This means the other leaders could be any leaders of a local indigenous community, or a business leader, or a civil society leader, and hopefully it also includes a leader at the urban or regional government level, or city or regional metropolitan government level. Based on our initiatives, or based on our efforts in relation with the office of the PGA, we are excited that we are now aware in the list of the speakers on the leaders dialogue on the second session. Mayor Valérie Plante will be addressing this dialogue in her capacity as Mayor of Montreal, but also ICLEI's Global Ambassador for Biodiversity. We haven't seen yet the full list of other stakeholders, so we don't know whether there will be others, but at least there is one slot. This will be a pre-recorded video, but obviously, if you recall the engagement of Mayor of Montreal and City of Montreal, they're host of the convention, and then they have been active in so many processes. It will be an encompassing message. It will definitely be addressing the Edinburgh process and others. Obviously, that's also good that Edinburgh process was available or concluded before this Biodiversity Summit, so that this could be also an opportunity to integrate. That's one point that I want to highlight. The second point is the COVID-19. You are all aware COVID-19 turned into an opportunity to raise the importance of nature in our cities. During these lockdowns, so many citizens, millions of people, when they were desperate, a small green corner at the edge of their street or at the edge of their neighborhood garden saved their lives. And the urban parks, the urban spaces had become really the place where people could refresh and recall the value. And it was even a refreshment for natural assets, because there were a lot of rivers or lakes were replenished, let's say, because there were less human activity, and the air quality was brilliant. There are photos you have seen from Kathmandu. You could see the mountains of the Everest or whatever for the past 40 years for the first time. So this was giving us the opportunity, and the COVID-19 process, in terms of especially the recovery process, should definitely have an element of creating or increasing natural assets in the cities. That is, I think, now becoming an issue that we could not ignore, and we should not let it happen otherwise. In that sense, an important thing also happened. The Minister of Environment of Japan has invited a number of actually the whole global community of climate change and ministers of environment to a virtual dialogue. That happened on the 3rd of September. This was interesting because it was an invitation of Minister of Environment to the rest of the Ministers of Environment through the UN Climate Change Secretariat, or with Climate Change Secretariat, let's say. They made the invitation themselves directly, but it was the UN Climate Change Secretariat that was their partner. This meeting also introduced a new concept, which is a redesign after COVID-19, which is, of course, a new terminology, but it is a very strong vision. It says that it is not just recovery or build back better. There are things that you cannot even sort out, even you build back better, because the system, the inherited system, is already wrong. You cannot change something wrong to a positive things if it is strategically wrong. If you have built your cities into a wrong perspective, in a false perspective, even if you embed the best environmentally safe or environmentally friendly buildings, if the city is designed in a wrong structure, that cannot change the result. Therefore, rebuilding a whole new set of cities, redesigning our landscapes is a concept that needs first huge, much bigger budget and much more planning. This is scary, but the post-COVID-19 could be the moment to introduce those things that we could never have thought before. The Japanese Minister of Environment has opened this space, and I think because it's through climate and environment process, it's an opportunity for the biodiversity process. And the good news, ICLEI's speakers, Mayor of Yokohama, Mayor of ICLEI's Biodiversity Center and Regional Director for Africa, Kobe Brandt, Cathy O, Councillor of Melbourne, has contributed in these discussions. And we would like to follow up with that so that we can connect this new mobilization to the biodiversity space as well. We also have seen the message from Regions 4 in this process, so that's in a good momentum. So let's hope that the next couple of days in the UN, in this UN 75, the mobilization, Climate Week, and the Nature for Life and the Biodiversity Summit would give us a new impetus so that your work could be strengthened. My final comment in this, I've listened to the comments of the Xero draft and the new version. Obviously, it's good that you have noted all these terminologies, but one thing you should be thinking about, that the wording called at all levels of governments is something that we are happy in most senses. And if you just lose cities and local authorities in several paragraphs, as long as you can keep this notion of all levels of engagement or all levels of government, you can still be interpreting that this is not that bad because it has a much more encompassing vision. Okay, that's my input, and wish you the best of success.
Thank you very much, Yunus, for those insights. Great, obviously, to learn from you and your experience with this process in the climate change space. So I think it's in everybody's interest if we learn from that process and take those learnings to obviously better enhance and improve the biodiversity process. So that's really great. And I think we all agree with you that globally we have an opportunity now post-COVID to really press the reset button, but really put all the work that we've been doing in the biodiversity space specifically into action and really as ICLEI always advocates for, that action happens at the subnational and local level. So thank you for those insights, and thank you to all of our speakers. We have a few minutes for questions and discussions. So I haven't noted any particular questions via the chat or questions answers, but we do have a couple of minutes. So if you want to make a comment or ask a specific question to any of our speakers, you are welcome to raise your hand. You should have that function in the toolbar under attendees. You have the option of either raising your hand, or you're welcome to obviously type it out, either using the chat or question functions. See any raised hands at the moment. It's also an opportunity just to make some generic comments and reflections, and that goes to our speakers as well. If there's any additional comments or inputs that you want to make, you are more than welcome to do so as well. Give it a few minutes. Thank you, Tamlin, for sharing the links to the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. That link is available in the chat, as well as the link to the latest Xero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So if you're interested in those two documents, please find the relevant links in the chat box. I do not see any raised hands. You're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question or share your insights or reflections.
Hi, Ryan, if I may, it's Renata here.
Hi, Renata.
I just wanted the opportunity to recall the very important message that Tamlin shared with the analysis of the updated version of the Xero draft. As she very well mentioned, there has been there are some issues that are still there that we haven't been able to insert our perspective in our recognition of our local and national governments in the updated version, at least. So it's important to reflect on that and be sure that it's time to double our efforts, our advocacy efforts towards this. The draft the document is still a draft and is still going to be negotiated. So it's also an opportunity to see those issues and to make sure that we do our best to make a change. And a simple step is by contacting not only the networks that are representing local and subnationals in these discussions, like ICLEI and ourselves, but also cities and subnational governments can do their best to contact their own national focal points, their own national delegations, and start this discussion, because it's in the end it's the parties that will vote on the new framework and that will support our requests and our suggestions. So it's a good start to knock on the door of your national focal points and see this updated version as an opportunity to double our efforts to influence the new framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Renata. And that's such a good point. And I think, if there's one positive of this whole COVID pandemic situation, is that it's allowed us some additional time to flesh out and deal with some of those issues as previously presented. So we thank you very much for those reflections.
Thank you, Renata. And Ryan, I can also just mention in the same vein as what Renata's just said, is to encourage those of the attendees that do work for cities, is to encourage their cities to sign the Edinburgh Declaration, which is available on the Scottish Government website. There's a whole process as to how you should go about to sign it. It spells it out in fine and clear details. So I think that is also an important addition to make, because that declaration is open for signature until the time of COP, and it is certainly something that we as networks of representing local and subnational governments will be presenting to the CBD parties, not just now at a webinar on the 23rd of September, but also will be engaging with the parties throughout the process, because it does capture those ambitions that have come out of the consultative process around the Edinburgh process, that reflects what the ambitions of cities are in terms of what they want and what they're prepared to commit to in terms of the new global biodiversity framework.
Thanks, Ingrid. So Joanna, see, Tamlin has just shared the link to the Edinburgh Declaration in the chat box as well. So our attendees can view it there as well. So thanks for that, Tamlin. So colleagues, I do not see any hands. There's no additional questions or comments. We'll move on. So as always, just to remind all our attendees and our partners and our peers about Cities with Nature, it's still going strong and still growing. As city numbers, member cities are continue to grow, and this is just a call to action to engage with the ICLEI team, be it through your regional office in the region where you find yourself in the world, or directly with the ICLEI Africa team, to encourage your cities to join Cities with Nature. It's a flagship community of practice around re-establishing and enhancing our Cities with Nature. So as I mentioned, the Cities with Nature community continues to grow, and we always welcome new cities and regions and partners to join us on this very exciting journey. Just in terms of our continuous work on the advocacy front, so for more information on these webinar series, information on past and upcoming events, and links to resources, etc., please make sure that you do visit the Advocacy for Nature website as well for some very insightful and staying up to date with the latest news and events as they happen. And I think with that, on behalf of the team at ICLEI Africa, on behalf of the Global Task Force, on behalf of our speakers, thank you very much everyone for joining and participating. And yes, we wish you fruitful deliberations whilst the subsidiary body engagements are continuing. Please keep safe during this unprecedented times, and we hope to see you soon at our next installment of the post-2020 webinar series. So with that, very much thank you, keep well, and all the best. Goodbye.